So before I made my way to Penn Station in New York this morning, I was on the computer and I saw a report that Sanders and Clinton were neck and neck in the polls in Nevada, in the Nevada primary. And I thought, I'll talk about voter disenfranchisement because something I've studied a lot and worked to prevent for about 25 years. But I want to talk about that in the context of this election. And feel free to interject because we're in a small room and we can be informal. And if you have questions or opinions, just shout them out. Every time there's a presidential election, a four-year election, people preach to each other that this is a really important election. And they generally say the same sorts of things. They say, of course, how the country and the world will be in danger if the guy, and it's always a guy, on the other side gets elected. And they also always talk about Supreme Court appointments, or one appointment, or maybe two appointments that are at stake. Well, this time I think there are 3 or 4 appointments that are at stake. And the world, there are wars raging around the globe. So I actually think it is an important election. Maybe more important than all those other elections. But actually what I wanted to talk about more than it's important, I didn't want to preach so much, I wanted to talk about the strangeness of this election. It's really sort of amazing. It's what some people call a kind of miracle moment in politics. Things are happening that can't be explained by the sort of truisms that political scientists repeat to each other. And in fact, their predictions, political scientists and the pundits, their predictions have really all been screwball. Absolutely, they haven't come true. And, maybe they're dire warnings, because they're, especially the centrists and the liberals, dire warnings about what will happen if you don't support Hillary. I'm on an email thread of very eminent political scientists. You can say, Matthew, I'm a political scientist and a sociologist.
Yeah.
And they evoke memories of what happened when McGovern ran, what happened when Mondale ran, that if you so much as say a nice thing about Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump will be the next president of the world. And then what? Well, so they're also intense on this, about this. They're so geared up to try to stop whatever might be going on is, I think, important. And also, I don't think anybody has ever been a serious contender for the presidency who has called himself, herself, a democratic socialist or a socialist. That has just not happened. And, he keeps saying that, and people just go on and tell the pollsters that they're for Bernie. So that's pretty amazing. So why is it happening? What's going on in the country? Well, social scientists have a lot of theories about sort of upsurges, rebellions, anger, political anger. And what the sort of core idea in these theories is that people rise up when the promises that have been made to them, in a sense, by their society, by their leaders, by their culture, when those promises are broken. And that makes a certain amount of sense, doesn't it? When they can't raise families, when they can't get a job, when they can't put food on the table, when they can't send their kid to school. So, there are a lot of broken promises in the world, but also in the United States today, in recent years. A lot of those broken promises have to do with very big changes that have taken place in the American economy that we sometimes call, in a sort of simple-minded way, we call it deindustrialization, but sometimes we call it neoliberalism, which refers to the importance of finance and international exchanges in the economy that has replaced an industrial economy. Well, there are very big changes in the economy, and they haven't been good for most people. Employment has become much more insecure. It used to be that you could get a job in the automobile factory, and you'd work there until you became eligible for your pension. And in the meantime, your son got a job in the automobile factory. The job paid enough for you to buy a little ticky-tacky house with a picket fence and maybe an RV thing for your summer vacations. And life was okay. It isn't anymore. It's very uncertain and very insecure. Your son is not going to get a job in the plant that you work at, and you may not be working at that plant for very long, and you may no longer be working at it already. So, moreover, if you are working, aren't there more seats?
Yeah, there are seats, 2 seats down
One,
here and one over
two,
there.
3.
Excuse me.
You can't get chairs for the other people?
Well, we have a couple seats here.
You happy to stand? Okay. So, not only is the job insecure, you don't know where you'll be working maybe next year or 5 years from now. You don't know where your son and your daughter will be working, but you're earning less money. You don't know, your pension may be at risk. And because you're working less money, maybe you can't make the mortgage, maybe you've got into deep debt. And then what's going to happen? Meanwhile, so, your sort of way of life, the things that anchor you, your family, your house, your community, has become insecure. And in a consumer society, you can't buy as much as you think you're supposed to be able to buy. And meanwhile, there is soaring inequality. You know that some people, not too many, but some people are getting so rich that there are, did I read on the train, 20 billionaires who have as much money as the bottom half of the U.S. population. You better check that before you use it. So, the promise of stability, affluence, consumerism, all those promises have kind of been broken for a lot of people. Not for everybody, but for a lot of people. Maybe that's why there is this kind of strangeness, discontent in the electorate. How come Hillary is not good enough for them? Bill Clinton was good enough for them 15, 20 years ago. I mean, his promises won voters, but Hillary, they're very skeptical of. So that's one set of broken promises, I think. But meanwhile, I think that there are another set of broken promises that may be at least as important, that have unfolded in electoral politics. You know, I know some of you are probably activists, and if you're activists, you have a kind of tenuous relationship to electoral politics. You're skeptical of it. It's full of thieves. Money buys everybody, and things like that. But what you also have to appreciate is that for a couple hundred years now, the promise of electoral democracy has been probably the most compelling idea in Western societies, because it's the idea that even though societies are very unequal, that political institutions nevertheless create a realm of equality. It's electoral politics. And it's that realm of equality. Why is it equal? It's equal because everybody has the vote and every vote is equal. At least in principle, that's the idea. Moreover, the idea is that those votes, when aggregated, can depose rulers. You can kick the sons of bitches out by voting at periodic elections. Now that's a remarkable idea, and it has really mesmerized people all over the world for a very long time. Whenever I think about that, I think about Haitians going to the polls to vote for Aristide. How do you pronounce his name? Aristide? I mean, and they're braving the Tantan Macus. I mean, this is so, but people do that all over the world because it's such a magical idea that if people get together, they can, in electoral politics, they're each of them equal to every other person, no matter how rich, no matter how beautiful. And if they get together, they can kick the government out. And governments, you know, have great resources. They have armies, they have legal authority. Oh, thank you so much. So it's a magical idea, and it's an idea to which those who are better off, best off, richest in every society, the propertied classes, have always been opposed. Always. And actually, when electoral rights expand, ordinary people do better, so there's a reason for them to be opposed. And you can understand why they would. They depend on government authorizing their dealings. They depend on government to create a framework that makes trade possible. They depend on government to justify the machinations of the banks, for example. So electoral democracy is threatening. And from the very beginning in the United States, that threat, by the beginning I mean the Revolutionary era, that threat has been dealt with by manipulating electoral representative arrangements. How is that done? Well, votes have to be translated into representation. The congressperson or the senator, right? How do you count the votes and translate them into representation? Well, in the United States, we, right in the Constitution, never mind the machinations since then, but the Constitution gave every state 2 senators, no matter whether there were any people in that state or not, giving landed property a lot of muscle. Or, and of course that, the principle of, it's a kind of gerrymandering, has continued to be very important in translating votes into representation and therefore into governmental authority. Or another way that elites have protected themselves against a democratizing government is by walling off certain parts of the government and saying that this part of the government is not exposed to the electorate, to the or to the representatives of the electorate. The Supreme Court is the most obvious example, but it's also true of port authorities, of bureaucracies to a certain extent, and so on. Or the final way that the title that you've given my talk refers to, the final way is by suppressing votes and voters. Now this is an interesting phenomenon because in political science we have a kind of faith like other people have, and one of the axioms of our faith is that competing parties expand voter participation. The logic of that argument is clear, that if you have competitive parties that want to win, they're going to try to bring new people into the electorate who will vote for on their line, right? Perfectly logical. That does happen. But what also happens, and what political scientists don't talk about at all, is that competing parties exert themselves to create conditions for voting that will make it hard for the groups that are likely to vote for the opposition to get to the polls. Now, did I say that clearly enough? It was a very long sentence. And that's just as logical as the first proposition, although you will not find it in any political science textbook, but you will find it in American history. You will find that that's what was done, for example, in the southern states after Reconstruction, when the Southern Bourbons worked to regain total control of Southern politics and the plantation economy. And to do that, they had to disenfranchise the newly enfranchised ex-slaves. And they used all of the methods that you sort of are familiar with from contemporary politics. They used literacy tests, they used difficult voter registration procedures, they used the device of making it hard to get to the polls, move the polls around so that nobody knows where they are. And there are all sorts of little tricks. And those little tricks that were really well developed in the South of the United States, they succeeded in disenfranchising virtually all blacks and many poor whites as well. Those tricks were then copied in the North in another period that was also very important for what it did to the American electorate. And that, you can call that the period of municipal reform. It was basically the turn of the 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, in the wake of waves of immigration to the United States. Now, the immigrants became the constituency of machine bosses. Everybody knows about machine bosses because they're in the movies sometimes. And these machines traded voter allegiance, voter loyalty for favors, so that the immigrant population they helped them to become citizens, they got their votes, they might get them a job, they might make sure that the saloon they patronized had a license. They also used penalties if you weren't loyal to the machine. If your kid got into trouble with the cops, you're going to have a hard time in night court. And that's the way in which the cities of the North and the Midwest were run in the late 19th, early 20th century. Businessmen had a problem with that arrangement because they wanted efficient services. These machine bosses might be good at passing out Thanksgiving turkeys and at bullying the saloon keeper, but they weren't as good at dredging the harbor, providing the kinds of services that a growing industrial economy needed. And that irritation and the need for good services helped to spike a reform movement led by business in the late 19th century. But to get rid of the machines, they tried to get rid of their voters, and they did get rid of a lot of their voters. They worked in the state capitals, these municipal reform organizations. They weren't reform organizations, they were business organizations. They worked in the state capital to introduce voter registration, literacy tests, poll taxes in New England states. And they succeeded in driving turnout among immigrant working class people down significantly. Now, all this was very, very different from the sort of model of how electoral democracy works that is used in political science. So now, of course, we have those problems. Vote suppression laws. You have to bring your citizenship papers to register. I'm a naturalized citizen. I haven't got a clue as to where my citizenship papers are. I became a citizen many, many years ago. So I have to get copies of my citizenship papers in order to register to vote? Or the many people from the rural South who don't have birth certificates, or the unbelievable error rate in the lists that are used by these officials. Of course there are a lot of mistakes because people are bored and annoyed, and so we're in another period of vote suppression at the same time as we're in a period of time when the amount of money flowing into electoral contests is absolutely unprecedented. Unprecedented. And, you know, in a way, it's such a cute little idea that we can wall off an arena of social and economic life and call it electoral politics. And in that arena, everybody will be equal because everybody will have an equal vote. But there is no wall there. The inequalities that are outside that arena spill over. And as those inequalities grow larger, the amounts of money available to corrupt electoral democracy increase. So we now have a situation where
Sorry.
That's okay, we need more chairs again. Look. I'm sorry. I mean, why am I apologizing?
They should have given you a bigger room.
At least we have the big strong men to go get the chairs for us, right?
Say that again.
At least we have the big strong men to go get the chairs for us, right?
Oh, okay, that's good. So, I want to bring it up to the contemporary period and the contemporary election. Because right now, this is going to be the most expensive, but every presidential election turns out to be the most expensive in history. Because as the concentration of wealth at the top increases, more of that money spills over into the electoral arena. And in fact, now I've noticed that the pundits talk not only about the polls, which way the voters are bending, but they constantly talk about the dollar race, who's getting the most money. And that's just as important, maybe it's more important, as the contest for voters. So that's one new thing, but it's always a new thing. As long as inequality continues to grow and wealth concentrations increase, every time there's an election, we're going to say it's the most expensive election ever. Unless we do something about the flow of money into elections. But there is another new thing on the electoral representative politics scene, and that is what is often called the new electorate. You've heard about that, the new electorate. This, I think, very, very important. It has to do with the fact that black voter turnout increased, and increased sharply in the Obama elections. It has to do with the fact that immigrant groups are increasing in numbers, especially Hispanics, Chinese to a lesser extent, and they are a large, as they become citizens and enfranchised, they're a larger and larger part of the electorate. It has to do with the fact that youth turnout jumped in 2008, to a lesser extent in 2012, but nevertheless, young people usually have low rates of voting. Now, in those elections, there was a big spurt in turnout. And of course, there's also the shift in the women's vote that has been wobbly, moved back and forth, but it's a development, a gradual development since 1980 and the Reagan elections. So this new electorate, a lot of innocent people looked at the data, at the demography, and said, well, we're never going to, a conservative is never going to be able to get elected in the United States with these demographic data. But that's not quite true, is it? Because demography doesn't translate into electoral statistics. It doesn't translate into electoral statistics because of voter suppression, because of the manipulation of the laws and the practices which determine, in large measure, who actually gets to vote. Or some of the laws have changed too, in reflection of the threat of the new electorate. It's not accidental that the Supreme Court, remember, that's one of the parts of government that the electorate does not influence very much. The Supreme Court struck down sections 4 and 5 of the Voting Rights Act, essentially disabling them. Those were the most effective parts of the Voting Rights Act and had a lot to do with the huge increase over time in the black electorate. Well, and then of course there's a case now pending in the courts in which there's an effort to change the formula for representation from the numbers of people, how many congresspersons, how many councilmen are you allocated, is now based on population. An effort to change that formula from numbers of people to numbers of active voters, which will take advantage of vote suppression to lower representation. Well, so maybe, people can't follow all this, it's too intricate and boring, but the general idea, the general drift of events is pretty clear, isn't it? Everybody knows about the money. Everybody knows about the Supreme Court. Everybody has heard about vote suppression. So I think there may be another set of broken promises that have to do not only with the economic situation, but have to do with the ability of people, with what they recognize as their ability to influence government. Now they think maybe they can't. And maybe that also has something to do with the rise of a kind of electoral insurgency reflected in the Sanders candidacy. Well, broken promises in the economy, broken promises in politics, probably accounts for the surge of movements in the last few years. And it really is a surge. A few years ago, when I said this is the beginning of a new movement era, people were very skeptical, but I don't think anybody can be skeptical anymore. First there was Occupy, and Occupy was all over the country, not just in Wall Street. And Occupy, everybody, the press mocked Occupy at the beginning. Oh, what are they doing? They're picnicking. They're having a sleep out. But then everybody started using Occupy's slogans, Occupy's language. They are the 1%. We are the 99%. Occupy succeeded in making extreme inequality an issue. And then there was the fight for 15. This also sort of unexpected. SEIU, a very big union, SEIU had a significant role in promoting $15 an hour as a goal and in working with the little groups that, did 1 and 2 day strikes at McDonald's or other fast food places and so forth. SEIU is a union. SEIU was doing this to build the union. They wanted more locals, more members. That didn't happen. What happened instead is a kind of movement took off that has had a big effect on state and local politics, and will probably have a big effect on the national minimum wage as well. And then Black Lives Matter. It's an incredible movement. I don't know how many of you have been involved in trying to organize. How many people are organizers of one kind or another? Well, it's hard work, one-on-one, house meetings, endless flyers. How many people can you get to the demonstration? 20? Oh, that's not enough, we gotta, But at certain moments, it's not so hard to organize protests. People are ready to come. And I think this is one of those moments. Moreover, there are also movements on the right. You're probably just like me, and when you say movement, you think only left-wing movements. But in fact, there are movements on the right. And this is a little complicated, because the movements on the right are not occurring among low-wage workers or racial or ethnic minorities, and they're not occurring among workers generally. They're occurring, according to the data I've seen, they're occurring among people who are middle class, who are earning more than the median income, who are a little bit old, who are older, and who probably feel that their world is being taken from them. I think when Donald Trump says, "Make America great again," speaking to those people and to their sort of imaginary past in a town that was vigorous and robust and all white, where women were women and men were men, and the Tea Party rallies. I don't know if they still do this, but the ones I attended did this. They had a chant. People raised their fists and they yelled, "Take it back, take it back, take it back." Yeah, from whom? But that's always the case. You shouldn't shrink because there are movements on the right. Movements on the left help to provoke movements on the right, for one thing. And there are strong currents of religious fundamentalism in the United States, strong currents of sort of macho culture, the gun lover culture, the imaginary pioneer culture. We got to live with that. But it doesn't mean that they're going to win, or it doesn't mean that they're a majority, or anyway, movements are not majorities. Movements are spearheads, they're not majorities. So, this is very, very important for rising movements, because movements, I think, that movements have played a key role in shaping the United States from the very beginning, from the Revolutionary War period. Our founding fathers that Justice Scalia talked of so often, may he rest in peace. Our founding fathers did have a disagreement with England, and mainly it had to do with business, it had to do with currency, it had to do with trade, because these were, you know, colonial 17th and 18th century businessmen. But they couldn't fight a war. There weren't enough of them. And they didn't like that trudging through the mud and stuff, that wasn't for them. So they needed the support of the laborers, the farmers, the artisans, the sailors, who were the population of the United States. And to get that support, they had to try to sort of indulge or co-opt the ideology of radical democracy that was spreading through the populace in the second half of the 18th century. And that's, I mean, all the idea of the revolution is about freedom and stuff like that. That came from this popular movement. And that popular movement had some influence on the governing arrangements that were established. Didn't create the whole government, but had some influence on the creation of electoral representative democracy after the revolution. And it, you know, sometimes I think that the American Revolution was the only successful revolution in modern history. Because the others had such pernicious and unexpected consequences. So there was the revolution and the abolitionists, another great movement that raised the cause of freeing the slaves and so aggravated the South as to force secession, and that in turn kicked off the Civil War. And after the Civil War, we did free the slaves, at least legally, even though there was a strong and successful effort in the South to subjugate black people and drive them back into plantation labor. So, or in the 1930s, you wouldn't really credit FDR with everything that was done in the New Deal, would you? FDR ran for president in 1932 with exactly the same platform that the Democratic candidate, John somebody, I've forgotten his name, ran on in 1928. What made FDR a radical was the rise of the movements, and especially the labor movement. And that really gave us some very important policies: Social Security, labor rights. They're not altogether gone yet. Our welfare policy, some of our public housing policies, which have been whittled away, but we got them through a movement. Or the civil rights movement, which finally did emancipate blacks, finally did shatter Jim Crow in the South and gave blacks the right to vote. Well, those were all movement victories, but it was movements interacting with particular electoral regime. Movements communicating issues that politicians wanted to avoid. Movements showing people that they could become defiant, and by becoming defiant they could make trouble, they could close things down, they could shut down cities in the South, they could shut down factories in the North. And those troubles, the trouble caused by movements, became troubles for politicians. They became troubles for a governing regime. And that's why we won things. We didn't win them otherwise. So I want to go back to the election of this election, 2016. It's taking forever.
That's for sure.
So there's an interplay between movements and elections. So the activists who are so quick to dismiss elections because they believe in movements, well, I believe in movements. But don't dismiss elections or electoral politics, because electoral politics can help to nourish movements. For example, and movements can nourish electoral politics. Do you think Sanders would be a candidate, a real contender, without Occupy? No. He couldn't do it himself. You know, he's been around forever. Not as long as I have, but he's been around a long time. And so the movements made Sanders possible. And Sanders' campaign encourages the movements. When Black Lives Matter forced Sanders to reconnoiter and give more weight to black issues, that strengthened Black Lives Matter. So the movements, some of the issues come from politicians in a way pandering to try to get support, but some of the issues come from the movements, reflecting the broken promises and the hopes of ordinary people. Well, here is where I want to end. I think Sanders could win. I think he could win the nomination, for sure. Not certain, because they have not pulled out all their guns yet. I don't know what will happen in a general election. It's amazing. What could they do? Just amazing. There's no precedence for this sort of situation. And you know, social scientists can't tell you anything without a precedent. It has to have happened before for us to tell you something about what it means and what caused it. But what really worries me is Sanders as president. Supposing we got over all those hurdles. Supposing he wins the primary and he becomes the Democratic Party candidate. And then suppose he wins the election. You know, the Republican candidate, Trump, he might win the election. But then he would be in the White House, surrounded by politicians who were determined to block him at every move. That, of course, was Obama's problem as well. Remember, Obama was all hope and change, too. Obama's the one who said, we are the ones we've been waiting for. So it may be at that juncture that movements again become very, very crucial to how a Sanders presidency develops, because movements can shut things down. That is their ultimate leverage. It's the ability of ordinary people to refuse to play their customary role, and to create what are in effect strikes in all sorts of arenas of social and economic and political life. That is a kind of popular weapon that could be equal to the gridlock that Sanders would confront if he won the election. So now let's have a conversation.